viewers, welcome to my channel. Before I start this video, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell for more updates. In this one, we're reading The History of Pearl Harbor by Susan B. Katz. Chapter 1, Setting the Stage. Understanding Pearl Harbor. It was a calm Sunday in Pearl Harbor, a large military base on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. It was a calm Sunday in Pearl Harbor, a large military base on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. A group of ships called Battleship Row lined the port, facing the mountains and palm trees of the beautiful island. Soldiers were watching for any signs of enemy submarines, but some also lazed around reading the newspaper or napping. Suddenly, a plane was spotted in the sky, then another and another. Just seconds later, soldiers peering out of their binoculars on the ship. The USS Utah saw a Japanese plane heading their way, and then BAM! A torpedo hit their ship. It was an enemy air raid. A second torpedo hit the USS Utah. Soldiers frantically scurried about. It was a surprise attack. One soldier headed downstairs to take cover. "Don't go down there. The ship is sinking," his captain shouted. So the soldier climbed up a ladder to the higher deck. Then another, to get to the top of the ship. With a huge plume of black smoke to his left, a Japanese plane circling overhead. His soldier could see enemy pilots aiming right for them. Half of the USS Utah had sunk. Until that Sunday, World War II was fought mainly in Europe, with Germany and Italy leading the charge to take over other countries. The U.S. had not entered the war yet. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack against the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor. The entire attack was over in about an hour and a half. Although short, it was devastating. 2,403 American lives were lost, and many more people were injured. The next day, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared war. Let's find out exactly how that fateful day played out. Who was Franklin D. Roosevelt? Roosevelt was President of the United States from 1933 to 1945. In a famous speech, he called the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor a day to which will live in infamy, meaning a day that would be famous for the wrong reasons. The world before Pearl Harbor. The World War I ended in 1918. Europe, especially Germany, Japan, and the United States were in terrible shape. Germans were angry because their economy, the system that affects how people make their money and who has jobs, was a mess. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. By 1939, he began to put an evil plan in place over Europe and kill all Jewish people. That awful time was known as the Holocaust. While the horrors of the Holocaust were happening, Japan was trying to take over many countries in Asia and the Pacific. The Japanese government attempted to gain control of many territories in Asia. In September of 1940, Japan joined forces with Germany and Italy. They were now fighting against Britain and France. Now World War II was being fought in both Europe and the Pacific. Although the United States hadn't entered World War II, they had problems with Japan. Japan and the United States were sort of frenemies, both friends and enemies at the time. Before the attack, the United States sent weapons, planes, and tanks to help Britain and France fight the war against Germany and Italy. They did not want to go to war. The United States did, however. The United States, however, did send Army Air Corps and Navy soldiers to places where they could defend their country. Pearl Harbor in Hawaii is 3,845 miles from Japan, but it was the closest to the U.S. base to Japan. The United States was preparing for war just in case of an attack. They needed troops nearby at the ready because at that time it took a lot longer to communicate from country to country. There were no cell phones, email didn't exist. People used telegrams to send messages and hand-wrote letters that were sent by boat or a plane. Chapter 2, Japan Makes Moves. The United States and the Empire of Japan. Japan was a small country without many important natural resources such as wood, metal, and oil. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States sold scrap metal and excess oil to Japan. Japan then used those resources to attack China in 1937, which began a war between the two countries. The United States ignored this at first because American leaders wanted to avoid a fight. But as more people found out about Japan's takeover of China, the United States cut off trade with Japan. This made the United States Japan's enemy. But the U.S. government was still on good terms with China. President Roosevelt made an embargo to stop any other countries from giving Japan resources it needed to take over East Asia. Japan did not like that at all. They felt it was their destiny or true purpose to take over China. The United States didn't want one of its friendly nations to be attacked. Then in September of 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, an area of Asia that is today Vietnam, Laos, and part of China. That is when President Roosevelt moved the U.S. Pacific Fleet. That is when President Roosevelt moved the U.S. Pacific Fleet of ships from California to Hawaii in case they needed to defend the U.S. if Japan was invaded. Germany and Italy had joined forces as the Axis powers. Japan joined the Axis powers by entering into agreement with Germany and Italy in 1940. Japan was sending a clear message to the United States that they were ready for war. The embargo Roosevelt placed on trade with Japan made it very hard for Japan to get the resources they needed, such as oil. This placed Japan and the United States at odds and on the verge of war. The plan of attack. Then Japan and the U.S. began serious negotiations or talks to see if they could come to a peace agreement. If they did not reach an agreement, they would have to go to war. Almost all of Japan's military officials thought that the country could not win a war against the powerful United States. Only one person, Japan's Admiral Isoroku Yamato, I'm just going to call him Isoroku. Isoroku thought that Japan could attack Pearl Harbor. To many people, it seemed very unlikely. But the Pacific Fleet was docked there, and the water was very shallow. That meant torpedoes, as a type of long, thin missile, would get stuck in the mud after launch. Navy Admiral Yamamoto believed that a huge successful surprise attack on Pearl Harbor could keep the U.S. from striking back right away. The admiral gathered expert engineers and military officials to start planning. Who was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo? Nagumo was the Japanese commander during the attack on Pearl Harbor. His boss Yamamoto's plan went full steam ahead. Nagumo decoded the words "climb Mount Nitika," which is the tallest mountain in Taiwan and one of the highest points in the Pacific. That was code for attack. Yamamoto came up with the plan to attack Pearl Harbor from the air, not just the water. The United States would not be expecting that type of attack. Both Japan and the U.S. had large aircraft carriers. These ships are a runway with them. These ships are a runway on them where airplanes can take off and on which they can land. The Japanese made a new kind of torpedo with wooden fins like fish that could be dropped into shallow water. Also, in Yamamoto's sneak attack plan, Japanese planes would arrive in 2 waves. His plan was very risky because the Pacific Fleet was so strong, and his type of attack had never been tried before. Japan planned this sneak attack for months and had to keep it a secret from soldiers who would be flying the planes. Yamamoto did not even tell the Japanese ambassador to the United States. They also needed to be extra careful about leaving because U.S. spies were watching Japan's ports, planning the attack on Pearl Harbor was done in bad faith because the U.S. and Japan were still at peace, or at least in peace talks. In mid-November, when the Japanese fleet started leaving Japan in small groups, so as not to make the United States suspicious, they anchored close to Hawaii for the attack. In the early morning hours of December 7th, 1941, Japanese soldiers received their final orders and boarded their planes to launch a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor on the United States. Chapter 3. Early Morning Hours. No turning back. At that same time in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, more than 100 American ships were docked. Some of them stretched as far as 2 football fields. There was a long line of big military barges called Battleship Row. Just 230 miles away, Japanese ships with torpedoes and planes at the ready, prepared to attack Pearl Harbor. 2 waves of planes were set to take off. The mini submarines were ready to launch underwater. The seas were very rough. Between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m., 1 and 3 a.m. on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese mother subs released 5 mini submarines carrying bombs meant to blow up the American ships' hulls. Just after 3 a.m., Japanese pilots woke up ready for the sneak attack. They got their final orders on deck and prepared their planes. At 6:15 a.m., they turned their planes into the wind. They managed to take off despite the strong gusts. The first wave of planes included 49 high-level bombers, 42 torpedo planes, 51 dive bombers, and 43 fighter planes, with a total of 183 planes. At 7:15 a.m., the second wave of planes took off. It included 54 high-level bombers, 78 dive bombers, and 35 fighter planes, for a total of 167 planes in the second wave. There were now 350 Japanese aircrafts flying toward Pearl Harbor. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida led his men toward an attack on the United States. Would it work out? Or would the American soldiers see signs of them approaching and thwart or stop this risky military move? Morning on Oahu. It was a typical Sunday morning for the thousands of American soldiers stationed in Pearl Harbor. They did not suspect that a sneak attack was already on its way. Soldiers were taking their posts, and walking about on the decks. There was even a military band playing their brass instruments on the deck of one ship. On December 7th, 1941, U.S. Army Air Corps crew members drank their morning coffee and went to religious services. One ship, the USS San Francisco, waited at Pier 17 to have barnacles scraped from the bottom of the hull. They had no power or weapons or ammunition. All of their supplies for battle were stored somewhere else. Who was Kenneth and Russell Warner? Kenneth and Russell were the only set of brothers on the USS Arizona to survive. 23 of the other 38 other sets of brothers both died when the USS Arizona sank. One brother of the other 15 sets also died. Many of the ships were named after the American states when the soldiers on them were born: Arizona, California, Oklahoma, and more. On their days off, soldiers could wander down through downtown Honolulu, or soak up the sun on a beautiful Hawaiian beach. Back in the early 1940s, life in Hawaii was simple and calm. There was no traffic lights because there was no traffic. Pineapple and banana plantations lined the island, and the airwaves was filled with sweet, fragrant flowers. But on this morning, the lounging around would come to be an abrupt end. While on deck, soldiers peered through binoculars, watching for enemy submarines. Their focus was on the sea, not the sky. When they spotted planes above, they assumed it was an American air drill at first. With such a strong fleet of ships docked at Pearl Harbor, how would anyone dare to attack the United States on their own soil? Chapter 4. Surprise Attack! Warnings ignored. There were many warning signs on the morning of December 7th, 1941. At 3:42 a.m., officers on the USS Condor saw submarines' periscopes sticking up out of the water. They messaged the USS Ward. The Ward found the Japanese sub and sank it at 6:45 a.m. That was the first casualty of Pearl Harbor. At around 7:30 a.m., Admiral Husband Kimmel, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, was told about the Japanese mini-sub, but did not act. He thought it was another false report and decided to wait and make sure it was true. Just after 7 a.m., the first Japanese fighter planes were spotted by the Army's Opana radar site on Oahu, Hawaii. The site that called Fort Shafter about the strange sighting on the radar. They waited for a commanding officer to return their call. Finally, Fort Shafter replied to the Opana radar site at 7:20 a.m. They thought the radar blip was U.S. planes B-17 Flying Fortress bombers coming from California. The officer who called back told Opana, "Don't worry about it." But the first real sign that the Japanese were about to attack was not bombs being dropped. On the morning of December 7th, American codebreakers discovered that Japan had stopped peace talks with the U.S. government. Officials in Washington tried to warn these soldiers serving in Pearl Harbor, but the message arrived in Hawaii at 7:33 a.m. Too late to stop the attack. At 7:49, as hundreds of Japanese fighter pilots neared Pearl Harbor, Commander Fuchita ordered his telegraph operator to tap out, "Tarara, tarara. Tara, tara, tara," to his pilots. Tara means tiger in Japanese. That was his code for attack, attack, attack. Attack overhead. 5 minutes before 8 a.m., Commander Logan C. Ramsey, stationed on Ford Island, noticed a low-flying plane. At first he thought it was an American pilot, but then he saw a bomb being dropped. "Air raid on Pearl Harbor! This is not a drill!" came the telegraph message from Ford Island. The first bombs hit Wheeler and Hickam Field. Who, in the middle of the attack, who were Wheeler and Hickam Field? Wheeler and Hickam were in the middle of an attack on the USS Arizona. Commander Casson Young stood soaking wet on the vessel's ship. which was attached to the USS Arizona, shouting at his men who were swimming away, "Come back! We're not giving up on the ship yet!" But the Japanese were not just attacking from the air. They planned a synchronized attack. Torpedoes launched underwater and bombs dropped by air hitting the same time at around 8 a.m. The first battleship was struck, the USS Arizona. The first battleship was struck, the USS Arizona, when a bomb hit its forward deck. A huge plume of smoke and ball of fire shot 50 feet in the air. Hundreds of men hit the deck, or were blown off the ship altogether. That one bomb killed more than 1,100 crewmen on the Arizona. The entire ship's band playing on the second deck was wiped out instantly. Just 9 minutes later, the USS Arizona began to sink to the bottom of the harbor. Marine Major Alan Shapley was blasted off the ship and partially paralyzed, but he managed to swim to Ford Island. Along the way, he stopped to help 2 shipmates. Radioman Glenn Lay was also launched into the air and off the deck. He found himself swimming in thick, oily water. Looking back at the Arizona, he could not see any signs of life. The next 5 hours were complete chaos, but it did not take very long for the United States to start fighting back. Chapter 5, The First Wave. A deadly beginning. It all happened so fast. There was no time for one ship to notify another. The next ship to be hit was the USS Utah. A torpedo struck the hull. On board, hundreds of soldiers scattered to safety. Through a big puff of black smoke, they saw a Japanese plane circling overhead. Wings tilted down as enemy pilots dropped more bombs. When the USS Helena was hit, the explosion sent another wave of panic throughout the harbor. Hundreds of surviving soldiers tried their hardest to fight back, even though they were at a tactical disadvantage. Firing at planes from the ground did little to stop the devastation. Metal pieces flew in all directions. The USS Tennessee's porthole cover tore loose. Metal pieces flew in all directions as the USS Tennessee's porthole cover tore loose. Soldiers tried to save their captains. Men led their comrades across wooden planks and down ropes to the safety of a rescue boat. Heroes like Joe George did not give up. Joe tossed a heavy anchor ball tied to a rope several times until it reached badly burned sailors on the USS Arizona. He encouraged each injured man to climb down a rope over the open water. 45 feet below, filled with flames, smoke, and burning oil, to a small vessel. "You can make it! Come on now, keep going!" Joe cheered as the brave soldiers on the brave soldiers as they lowered themselves down, hand over hand, that dangerous rope crossing. All the while, Japanese fighter pilots rained bullets down on them. Luckily, one group of men wasn't hit. Then Joe's captaining ordered him to cut the ropes and head out to sea. But Joe refused. Joe George never knew how many men he saved that day, but his bravery will not be forgotten by men such as Donald Stratton, who survived because Joe wouldn't leave his fellow seamen behind in peril. Drowned planes and sunken ships. All around Pearl Harbor, other ships were attacked. 3 torpedoes hit the USS Oklahoma, and the airmen were ordered to abandon ship. The Oklahoma capsized, turning upside down in the water. 32 men were rescued, but 429 died aboard the Oklahoma. More bombs were dropped, and the USS Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia all sank. The California was sinking and the Maryland and Tennessee suffered damage. Going down with them were soldiers who were also friends, fathers, sons, husbands, and even brothers. Some tried to swim to shore, but even though they were badly burned, Japan's goal was to destroy American planes before they could take off and fight back. Their targets were the U.S. military base Fields, Ford Island, and Battleship Row. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor destroyed and sank several ships within a couple of minutes. The USS West Virginia was hit by 7 torpedoes and 106 men were killed. USS Arizona suffered the worst loss of lives. 1,177 crewmen died, almost half the total lives lost that tragic morning. Who is Doris? Dory Miller was the USS West Virginia's heavyweight boxing champion and a cook. Although he was an untrained in combat when the attack happened, Dory Miller aimed a machine gun at the Japanese planes and started firing. For his bravery, Miller won the first Navy Cross ever awarded to an African-American soldier. Many sets of brothers were present at Pearl Harbor during the attack. Only a total of 79 individual brothers died. Out of a total of 79 individual brothers, 63 died. Only 4 brothers were recovered and identified. The other 59 were never found. From that moment, the U.S. Army changed its rules and no longer allowed brothers to serve together on the same ship or aircraft. Losing 2 sons at once was way too painful for any family to go through. Chapter 6: The Second Wave. The Second Wave. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave began their attack, including 78 dive bombers, 54 high-altitude bombers, and 35 fighters, 167 fighter jets, and 35 fighters, 167 planes in total. They attacked the battleship Pennsylvania, setting it on fire and bombed 3 destroyers at the Navy Yard dry pit pier. The USS Nevada had survived the first attack and was trying to sail to safety when it was struck multiple times and grounded. A soldier named Charles Christiansen tended to the injured. He described all the planes coming down, shooting machine guns at them, as looking like a swarm of bees. Claire Becker, newly married to Marine First Lieutenant Paul Becker, remembers the sky filling with smoke as she watched a Japanese torpedo plane whiz by the window of their house. The radio sounded, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an air raid. Take cover." The station played "The Star-Spangled Banner" before it went silent. Claire went outside and heard an explosion. She later found out it was the USS Arizona blowing up. Then Claire saw the Oklahoma roll. "You can't believe how fast a great big battleship can turn over," she said. The whole attack was over in about an hour and a half. At around 9 a.m., the Japanese started withdrawing and headed back to the aircraft carriers and eventually to Japan. On the night of December 7th, the sky above Pearl Harbor filled with thick smoke and the smell of burning metal and oil. Charles Christiansen looked across the harbor and saw the American flag still flying on the sunken USS California. "We lived the Star-Spangled Banner that night." That night, the rockets' red glare and bombs bursting in the air, Charles later said. Who is Madeleine Bolonsky? Madeleine was the Army's Nurse Corps second lieutenant who walked toward the hospital when the chaos began. She started tending to the wounded soldiers when nobody else was around. Lieutenant Blonsky cared for patients in temporary emergency rooms located at schools and in cafeterias. Success or failure? At the time, Pearl Harbor was the deadliest attack on U.S. soil. When it was over, more than 2,400 Americans were killed and just under 1,200 were injured. Not all the lives lost were military men and women. 68 civilians, regular people who just lived on Oahu, died. 19 U.S. Navy ships, including 8 battleships, were destroyed or damaged. But not all was lost. Luckily, the U.S. Pacific's Fleet 3 aircraft carriers had been sent out to sea by Admiral Camille and remained unharmed. When the Japanese couldn't find those aircraft carriers, they didn't hit any fuel storage tanks or submarines. They retreated and headed home. Still, Japan lost 29 aircraft, 5 mini-submarines, and 129 soldiers. One Japanese pilot was even taken prisoner by the United States. While the attack was a surprise, it may have not been considered successful. From the Japanese point of view, it was a very bad event for them in the end. The very next day, December 8th, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan, and the United States entered World War II. Not all who served Pearl Harbor were killed. 335 crew members from the USS Arizona survived. However, their parents did not know if they were dead or alive. Mothers and fathers waited for word. On December 9th, the Navy gave out postcards and told all the surviving soldiers to write home. George Smith, who was just 17 years old at the time, wrote, "Dear Mom, I'm okay, don't worry." Sadly, that postcard didn't make it to his mom until February. All that time, she prayed and hoped her son would still be alive. When the postcard worker got the card, and he closed down the post office, ran to the Smith's house, and woke up George's mother and stepfather at 6 a.m. "Your son's okay," he announced. George would not see his mother for another 2.5 years. After Pearl Harbor, the United States charged straight into World War II. George and thousands of other soldiers kept fighting in the war. Chapter 7. The Date That Lives in Infamy. The United States declares war. The next day, on December 8th, 1941, at 1:10 p.m., the United States declared war on Japan. President Roosevelt signed the Declaration of Independence on Empire of Japan at 4:10 p.m. The Senate, a group of powerful lawmakers, voted unanimously to approve going to war. Only one person in the House of Representatives, another branch of the U.S. government, voted against it. Who was Donald Stratton? Donald was the only person on the bow or top front part of the Arizona to survive the blast. He was saved by Joe George on the Vestal when he climbed hand over hand down the rope to Joe's encouraging words. President Roosevelt gave a speech to Congress asking the American people to declare war on Japan. In that speech, which he has since become famous, the president said, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with the nation and was still in conversation with its government and its emperor looking toward peace in the Pacific. The United States then joined the Allied powers in World War II. World War II was fought for 6 years during which more than 75 million people died. It was the deadliest war, fought by more countries than any other war in history in the world. More than 6 million Jews died, and 5 million Polish people disabled people, and Romani people. More than 11 million were killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. Japan, Italy, and Germany, the Axis powers, wanted to wanted power and land. The Allied powers, Great Britain, France, Russia, China, and the United States, fought against them to save lives. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped a nuclear bomb on the city of Hiroshima, Japan. Then they dropped another nuclear bomb at Nagasaki, Japan. On August 9, 1945, these weapons were devastating, killing between 150,000 and 246,000 people. These are the only times that nuclear bombs have ever been used as weapons of war. The bombings ended World War II as the Japanese surrendered or gave up on August 14th. The legend lives on. Today, Pearl Harbor is honored and remembered with the memorial on Oahu, Hawaii. The sunken USS Arizona and USS Utah are still there. The Pearl Harbor National Memorial is a national park and free museum where visitors learn about the attack and the more than 2,400 people who lost their lives. Pearl Harbor is very important because it caused the United States to declare war and enter World War II. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed this book and I hope to see you in my next video. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel, give a like, and hit the notification bell for more updates. And I will see you in my next video. Bye!